Hello, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Great, thank you. So my name is Bonnie Brzozowski. If you don't know me yet, I'm a reference librarian here at the Corvallis-Benton County Public Library, and I'm here to welcome you to today's random review. Thank you so much for all of you being here. We really appreciate it. Along with my coworker, Mike Hansen, we are the co-chairs of the Random Review Committee. If you don't know, the Random Review Committee is a group of 9 folks. We come together once a year to select the books and reviewers for this 10-month series. So thank you so much to the committee and to the Friends of the Library who help make Random Review possible. A special shout out to Gary Whitehouse for writing our fabulous press releases, which actually got published in the GT this month. I'm super proud of that. Normally I provide some links. I didn't provide them today, but just so you know, there is a Random Review webpage. You can find it from our homepage, the Corvallis-Benton County Public Library homepage. If you have any questions about how to access that, don't hesitate to ask me or anyone who works here at the library. But on that page, you'll find our schedule of events as well as recordings of the events. I do apologize. We did not get a recording of the November or the December events. We do have September and October. We had 2 differing technical snafus that hopefully we have worked out, and we are getting a successful recording today. I'm afraid last time it was an hour of nothing that we recorded. So, but we did test again. So I'm hoping that today we got it right. And I apologize and thank you for your patience while we work out our technical difficulties. I want to also remind you that the Friends of the Library does co-sponsor this event series. They not only founded and ran the Random Review series for 30 years, they also coordinate and they run book sales, and all of those funds benefit the library. So the Friends is a group that does a ton to support the library and all of the events that we do here. If you're interested in becoming a Friends member or volunteering for the Friends, you can go to the Friends website. It's friendsofthecbclibrary.org. And just ask me, and I'm happy to show you where that is. So let's get to our main event today, because I'm sure you don't want to hear from me anymore. Today we've invited Scott Heppel. He's the professor of fisheries in the Department of Fisheries, Wildlife, and Conservation Sciences at Oregon State University. And he's here to review Ed Yong's An Immense World, as you probably know. I'm going to invite Carl Schreck up here. He's one of our fantastic Random Review Committee members. He's going to come up and give us a little introduction of Scott, because he is the one who suggested Scott to do this review today. Thank you, Carl.
I'm, of course, having to rebuild my entire presentation. So. Hey, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Random Reviews. The book that Dr. Heppel will be reviewing is really about the animal and how it perceives its environment. And so that really means to understand a book like this, you have to understand animals and you have to understand environments, and sort of in their complexity. And I think you'll see that Scott fits the bill. He has university work at the University of Washington, graduating in zoology, and he followed that up with a master's and PhD from North Carolina State. And I believe in 1990 he received his PhD. Shortly thereafter, he joined the department that Bonnie talked about at OSU. And since that time, he's been doing what professors do. They profess, they teach, they mentor graduate students, they do community service and professional service, Scott's on a number of panels and commissions and that sort of thing. And in addition to that, he has to do research. And I think what you'll see is that the research that he does really fits this book nicely. He's an environmental physiologist. So he works at the boundary of the animal and the habitat. He's extremely broad in the number of critters he's worked with. He concentrates mainly on fishes, mainly marine fishes, but he's worked a lot in freshwater as well. But he's also published on birds and crustaceans, and so he has a good understanding of the diversity of life. In addition, he's worked in a lot of habitats, and that's the other side of the coin that you need to really understand this book. He's studied from Mexico up to Alaska on our coast, on the high seas on the other side of the country. He's really concentrated a lot more recently in the Gulf of Mexico. He's studied in the Mediterranean, Japan, and Hawaii. So I think he has an understanding of both the critter and the habitat. One of the things that I found interesting in Scott's background, to give you an idea of how you have to think about habitat, he's actually researched the soundscape of national parks and the soundscapes of the marine reserve environments. So it's a different way of thinking about the environment. And so with that, Scott, can you please tell us about An Immense World, How Animal Senses Reveal the Hidden Realms Around Us by Ed Young.
Thank you very much, Carl. And hello, everybody, and thanks for being here. Carl leaves out one important part about that work that I did in Japan, is that I had the pleasure of doing that work in Japan with Carl. All right. So you saw me frantically rearranging my PowerPoint here. Hopefully everything goes to plan from here on out. Sorry, is that better? Great, okay. So in May of 2021, I found myself on the deck of the fishing vessel Alice Faye in Port Orford along with a couple of colleagues from OSU. In pursuit of scientific knowledge to better understand how fish might perceive the world around them and how human activities can impact that. I could smell the sea, at least within the range of my olfactory capabilities. I could feel the cool morning air brush across my face, although I couldn't detect any fine-scale movements. I could feel and hear the low rumbles of the diesel engine, at least within my auditory range. I could see the waves rolling by with really extreme acuity. Humans have really good, but turns out with limited color. I could, if I'd wanted to, taste the bait we'd been using to lure unsuspecting fish, although I didn't. I could sense the pitch and roll of the boat through my vestibular, visual, and proprioception senses, but only within a general sense without extreme precision. It did strike me as odd at the time that I was working in an environment in which I am ill-equipped to perceive, using instrumentation that I can't hear to determine if fish respond to stimuli that I can't detect. Our acoustic tags, which we were using to track the movements of fish, transmit at 69 kilohertz. The upper end of human hearing is at 20 kilohertz, way above anything I can hear, right? And I have only the faintest ability to detect the pressure pulse and changes in the water that are generated by moving water, by sound. But on board, we had 69 kilohertz detectors. We had hydrophones sensitive enough to detect not just pressure, but particle movement underwater. Plus, the boat was equipped with radar to see the skies above, sonar to image the water below, a magnetic compass to help find our way home, and if that wasn't enough, a global positioning system unit that allowed us to use artificial celestial navigation to find our way, as well as temperature probes, pH probes, and dissolved oxygen probes to tell us about an environment that nature did not equip us to understand. And yet, as we'll learn today, much of nature can do just that. So really, why were we there? Well, we were putting out these acoustic tags. We were tracking fish movements, telemetry we call it. And we were working with lingcod, black rockfish, China rockfish, because the research vessel Langseth, shown here, which is a National Science Foundation vessel, was prowling the Pacific coast, conducting a seismic survey of the Cascadia subduction zone. Effectively, it was providing information that we need to inform science and protect human life as we prepare for the big one. But there might be repercussions to other life as we seek to convenience ours. For the seismic survey, the ship was setting off air gun pulses, 700 cubic inches per pulse, which is a lot, at a decibel level in excess of 200 decibels, which is a lot, every 20 seconds, more or less 24 hours a day for over a month. Of course, sound isn't very directional, air guns are very loud, and many animals which swim, crawl, sidle, and float in the ocean have the capacity to sense across a broad range of frequencies. So the underlying question was, do sonar pulses impact fish behavior in any detectable manner? Lots has been done on understanding acoustic impacts on marine mammals, and we know that some species strand when confronted with Navy sonar, particularly marine mammals. We know less so on the subcharismatic types that ply our ocean's water. But let's start with how we perceive to begin with. Imagine a world where everything is dark. There are no senses. Evolution shows us, and the evolution of the eye, which is written in the book, the very first photosensitive structure could detect light. It was binary, yes, no. Is there light or not? It could be reliable for a variety of different reasons. You could tell whether it was day or night. As we progressed, light detection became more gradated. We could tell shades, and that allowed animals to progress. And then, once those photoreceptors organized themselves into what we might consider to be eyes, imagery could be detected. Maybe it wasn't perfectly well focused, it certainly wasn't in color, but at that point in time, we had the ability to see scenes. Those are the first three stages of what Dan Erik Nielsen calls the development of vision through stages of increasing complexity. The fourth stage is high resolution vision. When it first appeared, Yang says, it would have intensified the interactions between animals. Conflicts and courtships could play out over distances longer than touch or taste would allow, and at speeds too fast for smell. Predators could now spot their prey from afar, and vice versa. Chases ensued. Animals became bigger, faster, and more mobile. Defensive armor, spines, and shells evolved. The rise of high-resolution vision might explain why, around 541 million years ago, the animal kingdom dramatically diversified, giving rise to the major groups that exist today. And yet, as we will learn in Ed's book, while this is what we consider to be the pinnacle of perceiving our world, what we get as a human species is yet a narrow sliver of everything out there is to perceive. And this is what Ed Yong's book is about. Which brings us to admit that as hot as we think we are as humans, there is an immense world out there. Okay. Ed Yong's book is an immense world. In it, Yang works to convince us that the immense world that we can't detect, but scads of other animals can, is worth not just our attention, but our respect, and our recognition that an animal's, what he calls Umwelt, whether perceptual world, which was coined by German zoologist Jakob von Uexküll 100 plus years ago, across all the hundreds of thousands of animal species is more varied than we can relate, and that while we think we know so much, there's a universe of perception out there about which we've only touched the surface. And here's a key point that he makes. What we consider extraordinary, the ability to see infrared or ultraviolet, or hear below those 20 hertz or above 20,000 hertz, to detect magnetism using use echolocation, to the animals using them is ordinary. It's just what they do. We're just jealous, right? So what we lack is not superlative to describe these feats, but the worldview, the Umwelt, to understand them. But science, and Ed Yong, is working to do just that. So here's a brief bio for Ed Yong from his website, Abridged. Ed Yong is a British-American science journalist, a Pulitzer Prize winner, and the author of 2 best-selling books. He won his Pulitzer Prize in explanatory journalism for his coverage of the COVID-19 pandemic. He's the author of 2 New York Times bestsellers, An Immense World, Here Are Today, about the extraordinary sensory world of other animals, and I Contain Multitudes, about the amazing partnership between animals and their microbes. An Immense World won the Carnegie Medal for Excellence in Nonfiction and the Royal Society Trivedi Science Book Prize, finalist for 4 other major awards, so on and so forth. More personally, Ed says he cares deeply about empathetic, accurate, nuanced, and curiosity-driven reporting. Through his journalism, he tries not only to describe what is happening, but also help people make sense of it, to bear witness to suffering, to speak truth to power, to reveal wonder in the obscure, and to push for a more just and equitable world. He has written about the origin of life itself in the modern-day extinction crisis, the way science is conducted, and scientists who are fighting extinction crisis, or to make it more relatable and inclusive, the people who are still suffering from the long-lasting consequences of viral infections and societal forces that said infections reveal and exploit, and the invisible microbes that profoundly shape our lives. While I'm providing a review today, I thought I would give a brief excerpt from a review from the New York Times of Books, where Jennifer Salai writes that I found myself surprised at so many moments while reading An Immense World, Ed Yong's new book about animal senses. That I found myself surprised speaks to his exceptional gifts as a storyteller, though perhaps it also says something regrettably about me. I was marveling at those details because I found them weird. But it turns out, if I try to expand my perspective just a bit, they aren't so weird after all. One of Jung's themes is that much of what we think of as extraordinary, as I was just explaining, is simply sensory. A term like ultrasound is an anthropogenic affectation. The upper frequency limit for the average human ear might be 20 kilohertz, but most animals can hear well into the ultrasonic range. She continues, understanding this requires us to stretch the boundaries of our own unique sensory bubble in order to glean what we can of how other species experience their surroundings. Jung's book is funny and elegantly written, mercifully restrained when it comes to jargon, though he does introduce a helpful German word that he uses throughout, Umwelt. Okay, so to get a sense of what he's talking about, I'm going to work us through exploring the Umwelt of several animals as described by Jung. I'll only touch on a few because there are so many amazing examples in this book, and I also don't want to give away all the wonder. But here are a few that stood out to me. We'll go over these that I want you to hear. I think you'll see that they do inspire true wonder in the natural world. And I also want to point that at all the photos I'm going to show, except for a couple that have photo credits on the slide, are either mine or my son's. Okay. I'd be remiss to not include a picture of my dog Zoe, a 3-year-old Labrador Golden Cross who is very curious. Because our Umwelt is so visual, you are perhaps first connected with those soft brown eyes she employs to good effect for treats and belly rubs. But today we're going to focus on the leading feature, her nose. I don't think he's been here before, Alexandra Horowitz tells me, so it should be very smelly. By he, she means Finnegan, her ink-black Labrador mix, who also goes by Finn. By here, she means the small windowless room in New York City in which she runs psychological experiments on dogs. By smelly, she means that the room should be bursting with unfamiliar aromas and thus should prove interesting to Finn's inquisitive nose. And so it does. As I look around, Finn smells around. He explores nostrils first, intently sniffing the foam mats on the floor, the keyboard and the mouse on the desk, the curtain draped over the corner, and the space between my chair. Compared to humans who can explore new scenes by subtly moving our heads and eyes, a dog's nasal explorations are so meandering that it's easy to see them as random and thus aimless. Horowitz thinks of them differently. Finn, she notes, is interested in objects that people have touched and interacted with. He follows trails and checks out spots with other dogs have been. He examines vents, door cracks, and other places where moving air imports new odorants, scented molecules. He sniffs different parts of the same object, and he'll sniff them at different distances, like he's approaching the Van Gogh and seeing what the brushstrokes look like up close. They're in a state of olfactory exploration all the time. He then goes on to say, take a deep breath, both as demonstration and to gird yourself for some necessary terminology. When you inhale, you create a single airstream that allows you to both smell and breathe. But when a dog sniffs, structures within its nose split that airstream in two. Most of the air heads down into the lungs, but a smaller tributary, which is for smell and smell alone, zooms to the back of the snout. There it enters a labyrinth of thin, bony walls that are plastered with a sticky sheet called olfactory epithelium. This is where smells are first detected. Okay. Humans share the same basic machinery, but dogs have just more of everything. A more extensive olfactory epithelium, dozens of times more neurons, almost twice as many kinds of olfactory receptors, and a large olfactory bulb in their brain. The shape of their nostrils adds to this effect. If a dog is sniffing a patch of ground, you might imagine that every exhalation would blow odorants on the surface away from the nose. But that's not what happens. The next time you look at a dog's nose, notice that the front-facing holes taper off into side-facing slits. When the animal exhales while sniffing air exits through the slits and creates rotating vortices that waft fresh odors into the nose. Even when breathing out, a dog is still sucking air in. In one experiment, an English pointer, who was curiously named Sir Satan, created an uninterrupted inward stream for 40 seconds, despite exhaling 30 times during that period. So there is smell, and I'm going to skip over taste. This curious creature is the mantis shrimp, known by those who encounter them when fishing as thumb splitters. Don't put your hand in one of their tanks. But that's not the feature for today. The feature for today is that it has one of the most amazing visual systems in the world. Ed is in somebody's laboratory. Don't get hit by these guys, Street says emphatically. I take her advice. Instead of testing the peacock pod's patience, I stare at its eyes. There are two of them which look like pink muffins wrapped in blue foil. They sit on top of the animal's head at the ends of mobile stalks. The left one is staring at me. The right one is looking at Streets. They are arguably the strangest eyes on the planet, and they see color in a way that no other animal shares. Of all the creatures we have encountered so far, the mantis shrimp's umvelt is the hardest to imagine. After more than 3 decades, Justin Marshall, who runs the lab where Streets work, still struggles to do so. He began his studies by dissecting the eye of a peacock shrimp. Like other crustaceans, these animals have compound eyes, which consist of many separate light-gathering units. But uniquely, each eye is split into 3 sections. There are 2 hemispheres with a distinct midband running through them, like the tropics wrapping around the Earth. Over a few intense weeks, he and a colleague worked their way through the eye, analyzing any photoreceptors they could find. And to their shock, they found not one class of photoreceptors, and please note that we have 4. They found at least 11. It didn't make sense. We found a new one every time we looked. That was the most miraculous period of my whole career. Justin and I working together in discovering this. The mantis shrimp could have a color vision system that outperforms anything previously described, the duo wrote in 1989, or as Marshall puts it, there were a lot of, and I'm paraphrasing here, F words. Mantis shrimps have more classes of photoreceptors covering the ultraviolet spectrum than we have in total. What could they possibly be doing with so many? Could they be dodecachromats? That is seeing 12 different colors where we see 3 plus light and dark. Or are they performing 4 kinds of trichromacy, 3 times 4 in each of the midbands arrays? Either way, they must surely be connoisseurs of color, able to tell even the subtlest differences between nigh indistinguishable hues. A coral reef looks stunning enough to us. What must it look like to a mantis shrimp? Speculations have run amok. Imaginations have run wild. The Oatmeal, an online comic strip, suggested that where we see rainbows, mantis shrimp sees a thermonuclear bomb of light and beauty. That's the black in that illustration I gave you at the beginning. Moving on. Snakes get a bad rap in some people's minds. They slither, and some find that unappealing. But they're truly remarkable in several ways. For snakes, in the pit viper family in particular, the real star is their ability to be heat-seeking predators, something we can only do in a very rudimentary fashion. Heat-sensitive pits have evolved independently among 3 groups of snakes. 2 of these, pythons and boas, are non-venomous constrictors that kill with suffocating coils. The third are the highly venomous and aptly named pit vipers, like the one shown here. Cottonmouths, copperheads, moccasins, rattlesnakes. Rattlesnakes will strike at warm objects, preferring freshly killed mice over long deceased ones, and they'll hit their targets in complete darkness. Even a congenitally blind rattlesnake that was born without eyes could kill mice as effectively as a sighted individual. Thanks to its pits, its aim was good enough not only to hit rodents, but to specifically strike them in the head. A pit viper's thermal sensitivity comes from the structure of its pits, which are similar to those on a tick's leg. To get an idea of their shape, imagine placing a miniature trampoline on the bottom of a goldfish bowl. Odd analogy. And turning the whole thing on its side. There's a narrow opening leading into a wider air-filled chamber across which thin membrane is stretched. When infrared radiation passes through the opening, it falls upon the membrane and heats it up. This happens readily because the membrane is exposed. It is oiled with some 7,000 nerve endings that detect the slightest rise in temperatures. Those nerves carry a particularly sensitive heat sensor gene, carrying 400 times as much of it as neurons anywhere else in the body. They'll respond if the membrane rises in temperature by as little as 0.001 degrees Celsius. This astonishing sensitivity means that a pit viper can detect the warmth of a rodent from up to a meter away. A blindfolded rattlesnake, and don't try this on home, because sitting on your head could sense the warmth of a mouse on the tip of your outstretched finger. All right, perhaps we'll move into the more cute and cuddly here for a moment. And we'll talk about sea otters. Cute, fuzzy, playful, and with the highest density of fur of the animal world, more hairs per square centimeter than most humans have on their entire head, and certainly those of us that don't have as much hair as we used to. The sea otter's ability to discriminate by sense of touch should give you pause. Thank you. Those paws don't look like sensitive hands, though. They barely look like hands at all. The skin has the texture of a cauliflower head, and the digits aren't clearly separated. If you held the paw, you could feel the nimble fingers moving underneath, but if you just looked at it, you'd see knobbly mittens, Strobel tells me. To measure what these mittens are capable of, she put Selka to a test. She trained the otter to recognize the feel of textured plastic board that was covered in thinly spaced ridges. Selka then had to distinguish that board from others whose ridges were either slightly narrower or slightly further apart, and she did so reliably and repeatedly, even when the ridges differed in their spacing by 1/4 of a millimeter. Her paws really were as sensitive as her brain would suggest, because they had looked at the tactile proportions of the brain. Sensitivity, however, is not the only metric by which a sense can be judged. Humans and dogs can both follow chocolate-scented strings, that comes earlier in the book, but the former species labors slowly, that's the humans, the task, while the latter does it quickly and assuredly. Likewise, Strobel found that humans are just as sensitive as sea otters at discriminating textures with their hands, but the sea otters are substantially faster. In her experiments, human volunteers repeatedly ran their fingertips over 2 possible boards, again and again, until they finally made their choice. Selka picked the right board as soon as she laid her paws on it. If the first one she touched was correct, she didn't even bother feeling the second one. She made her choice in 1/5 of a second, 30 times faster than humans. Even her slowest decision times were considerably faster than those of the fastest humans. They're very confident in what they're doing. And perhaps they have to be. Imagine that right now. A sea otter is about to search for food, floating on its back on the surface of the sea. It rolls and dives. It will only stay submerged for a minute, roughly the time it will take you to read this paragraph. The descent eats up many of those precious seconds, so when the otter reaches the right depth, it has no time for indecisiveness. In a few frantic moments, it presses its knobbly mittens over the seafloor, inspecting whatever it can find. The water is dark, but darkness doesn't matter. To some of the most sensitive paws in the world, the ocean is bright with shapes and textures to be felt, grasped, pressed, prodded, squeezed, stroked, and manhandled, or otter-handled, I suppose. Hard-shelled prey nestle among the similar hard rocks, but in a split second, the otter feels the difference between the two and pulls the former from the latter, making a fine meal. So that's direct touch. We're now going to move forward with a little more entertainment, and we're going to talk about flow and seal whiskers, another cute, fuzzy marine mammal. This time featuring not their furry feet, but the whiskers on their faces and their ability to track not something that they can see, but something that was just there. Sprouts, who is a seal, has around 100 facial whiskers protruding from his snout. When he dives into the water, his whiskers brush along the sides of his tank, allowing him to closely follow the curving walls without ever bumping into it. As a fish swims, it leaves behind hydrodynamic wake, a trail of swirling seawater that continues to whirl long after the animal has passed. Seals, with their sensitive whiskers, can detect and interpret these trails. This ability was only discovered in 2001. That's not that long ago. By Guido Danhart and his team in Rostock, Germany. They showed that 2 harbor seals, Henry and Nick, could follow the underwater path of a mini submarine. They clung to the trail even when their eyes were blindfolded and their ears were plugged with headphones. Only when their whiskers were covered by a stocking did they lose the sub. At the time, most researchers believed that hydrodynamic senses would only work over short distances. The disturbances created by a moving underwater object ought to die away so quickly that beyond a range of a few inches, they would be undetectable. But hydrodynamic wakes can actually persist for several minutes. Danhart demonstrated that a swimming herring should leave a trail that a harbor seal could follow from almost 200 yards away. Sprouts might be getting on in years, this captive seal, but his hydrodynamic sense is still sharp. Reichmuth tests it using a ball that's mounted on the end of a long pole. She walks around the edge of the pool, moving the ball through the water in a sinuous trail. After a few seconds, Sprouts, who was waiting patiently, gets the green light. He searches around, sweeping his whiskers from side to side. As soon as they make contact with the ball's wake, Sprouts instantly turns and follows it. He isn't just heading in the rough general direction. He's following the exact path of the ball in minute detail, up and down, in and out, as if pulling himself along an invisible rope. He can't be relying on vision. Even if his eyes weren't so old, he's wearing a custom-made blindfold. Instead, he's picking up on a track of invisible whirling vortices temporarily imprinted on the water. When he starts to stray behind the trail, he moves his head from right to side to the left side, finding the edge, just as a snake might do with its forked tongue. When the trail crosses a gushing water pipe, he temporarily loses it, but quickly picks it up again on the other side. His whiskers can feel what was rather than what is. Similarly, and I'm not going to spend much time on this, but we will pause briefly, is that fish as well have the ability to detect pressure and motion through their lateral lines. These are sensory structures along the sides of their bodies that sense not touch, but changes in pressure. When snails and other underwater predators charge at a group of fish, the schools move as one, right? Schooling behavior. The fish don't flee in random directions. They don't collide with each other. They seem to flow around their attackers like the very water in which they're immersed. This miraculous feat of coordination depends partly on vision, but it also depends on a system of sensors called the lateral line. The lateral line is found in all fish and some amphibians. It usually includes a smattering of visible pores on a fish's head and flanks, along with fluid-filled canals running just below its skin. After describing the pores in the 17th century, and here's how fast science progresses sometimes, scientists spent 200 years thinking that they were mostly just secreted mucus. But on closer inspection, they noticed small groups of pear-shaped cells capped in gelatinous dome. These structures, now called neuromass, were obviously sensors. In the 1930s, Sven Dijkgraaf showed that blind fish can use their lateral line to detect currents produced by objects moving nearby. More impressively, he showed that they could also detect stationary objects by analyzing the currents that they themselves produce. Sensing world in ways that we can't even imagine. Moving on within the realm of mechanical movements, I'm going to talk about, make sure I got these in the wrong order. Come back. First, about alligator lips. Okay. In the summer of 1999, before cave fish came into her life, Soares was sitting in the back of a pickup truck next to a large alligator that has been collected by the Fish and Wildlife Service. During the long ride, she got a good look at her companion's taped mouth. That's how she first noticed the bumps. Now keep in mind, alligators and crocodiles are among the largest reptiles in the world. They're covered in scaly skin, hard enough, tough enough that we sometimes make boots out of them. Their toothy mouths might inspire fear, and their smiles connote an insincerity. But did you know that their lips are sensitive enough, and the alligator can hold still enough to detect a single drop of water falling on a still pond? Alligators have row of dark raised domes along the edges of their jaws, as if they're wearing beards made of blackheads. Scientists first described these bumps in the 19th century, but nobody knew what they were for. I thought they got to be some sort of sensory thing, Soares says. Back in her lab, she found that the bumps contained nerve endings, but she couldn't find any hairs, pores, or other obvious sensory structures that might stimulate those nerves. Working with sedated alligators that were lying in the water, Soares tried exposing the bumps to light and electric fields or bits of smelly, tasty fish. They didn't react. Then one day, she reached into the water to retrieve a tool that she had dropped. As her hand broke the surface, it caused ripples, and these ripples hit the alligator's face. The nerves in its bumps finally started to fire. I called a friend over to confirm that I wasn't hallucinating. They sit in ambush in that layer of surface water, waiting for something to land. If a single drop falls, they react. Oddly enough, and we're talking about fully grown alligators there, frogs lay their eggs in clutches, and somewhere between that perceived auditory system and the mechanical feelings of touch lie vibrations. And when they lay their eggs in clutches, there was a discovery made a few years ago, which I'll read to you in just a moment, that showed that at the earliest stages of larval development, these frogs can sense vibrations of predators as follows. In 1991, Karen Warkentin was living the dream. They loved frogs and snakes, and as a new PhD student, they had somehow ended up in a place with plenty of both, Costa Rica's Corcovado National Park. Sitting by a pond, they'd observe the abundant red tree frogs and their lime green bodies, orange toes, electric blue thighs, yellow striped flanks, and so on. In just one evening, each female would lay around 100 eggs, which she'd encase in jelly and stick to the leaves overhanging the water. But around half of the clutches were devoured by cat-eyed snakes. The other would hatch after 6 or 7 days, releasing their tadpoles into the water, or occasionally onto Warkentin. It was pretty common in the field to have tadpoles falling in your hair, tadpoles falling in your notebook. I also had the experience of bumping into a clutch and seeing a few embryos hatch out very quickly. That was weird. The tadpoles weren't passively spilling out of eggs that Warkentin had broken. It looks as if they were actively making a run for it. If they could do that when Warkentin bumped them, could they also flee from an attacking snake? Could they sense the motion of chewing jaws and decide to take their chances in the water? Warkentin presented this idea at a scientific meeting and was met with skepticism. Frog embryos were meant to be passive entities that hatch on a fixed schedule and are oblivious to their environment. Some people thought it was a crazy idea, Warkentin said. I thought it was a testable one. They collected batches of eggs and housed them in outdoor cages along with cat-eyed snakes. The snakes are nocturnal, so when Warkentin had to check them on throughout the night, they'd sleep on a couch in an adjacent building, suffer through the clouds of mosquitoes, and wake up every 15 minutes to groggily inspect the eggs. It was rough, but they were right. Embryonic tadpoles can hatch early when attacked. Warkentin even saw them bursting out of eggs that were being held in a snake's mouth. If you've been to a rock concert, Come On, Feel the Noise might be an appropriate song by Quiet Riot. Anyone? No? Yeah. You know that some sounds can be felt as much as heard. And speaking of herds, it turns out the elephants not only can detect these sounds, they can use them to communicate in ways that would make jealous the lowest bass in an a cappella group. Oops, lost my bookmark. Where's my, give me just a second here and I'll track it down. Oh, there it is. In May 1984, and this is a homegrown example, Katie Payne found herself in the company of several Asian elephants at Washington Park Zoo in Portland, Oregon, 16 years after she and Roger Payne learned that humpback whales sing. She was searching for another species to study. As she observed them, she occasionally felt a deep shuddering sensation in her body. It had been like the feeling of thunder, but there'd been no thunder. There had been no loud sound at all, just throbbing and nothing. The feeling stirred memories from her teens of singing in a chapel choir and feeling the pipe organs. They left recorders running around the clock to note the animal's behavior. Payne didn't listen to the tapes until Thanksgiving, and she began with the recording from one especially memorable event. She had felt that familiar silent throbbing at the time when two elephants, Rosie, which some of you may remember from the Washington Park Zoo, and Tunga were facing each other on opposite sides of a concrete wall. At the time, they seemed silent, but when Payne sped up the recordings from that encounter, raising their pitch by 3 octaves, she heard what sounded like mooing cows. Across the concrete divide, and unbeknownst to the nearby humans, Rosie and Tunga were having an animated chat. Payne's discovery, which she published in 1984, made perfect sense to Joyce Poole and Cynthia Moss, who had been studying African elephants in Kenya's Amboseli. They'd noticed that elephant families would often move in the same direction for weeks at a time, even though they were separated by several miles. In the early evenings, different groups would also converge on the same waterholes at the same time, but from different directions. Infrasound, things we can't hear, carries over long distance, even in air, and if elephants use it to communicate, that would explain how they can synchronize their movements across a savanna. Quite different, perhaps, from a large elephant is the small fly Omnia. Omnia is a particular variety of parasitic fly whose job it is to find crickets. Male crickets are noisy. They have a ridge on their wings, as we know, to produce those big cricket chirp, chirp, chirps. And there's a parasitic fly that usually tracks them by sight or smell. But this fly, Omnia, half-inch long, lives throughout the America, uses sounds. Like female crickets, it listens out for the song of a male. Homing in on those chirp, chirp, chirps, it lands either on or near the singer and deposits its young, which then burrow in and devour the cricket. An unhappy end for that male. Omnia's ears are not obvious. I think you'd struggle to find ears on an animal like that. But Daniel Roberts is so familiar with insect ears that when he first looked at the fly under the microscope in the early 1990s, he instantly recognized a pair of eardrums, two thin oval membranes just below the neck. These are very different from most flies, which are usually feathery. They're much closer to that of a female cricket, and they're similarly tuned to the frequency of the male's song. The sole job of the ability to carefully hear, as he says, despite the superlative acuity, Omnia's ear control is very simple behavior. Find cricket. All right. This next one of my last couple, has to do with echolocation. And I will be honest with you, my notes when I wrote this down simply say, that's crazy. Okay. Dolphins belong to a group of whales known as odontocetes, or toothed whales. The other members of this group, porpoises, belugas, narwhals, sperm whales, and orcas, also echolocate. They are using sound production and bounce back to find things in the environment. And many do so just as well as the familiar bottlenose. Keep in mind that bats do something similar. In 1987, Nachtigall's team started working with a false killer whale, an 18-foot-long black-skinned dolphin species known for being smart and sociable. The animal, Kina, could use her sonar to tell the difference between hollow metal cylinders that looked identical to the human eye and then differed in thickness by the width of a hair. On one memorable occasion, the team tested Kina using two cylinders that had been manufactured to the exact same specifications. To everyone's confusion, Kina repeatedly indicated that the objects were different. When the team had the cylinders measured, they realized that one had a minuscule taper that was 0.6 millimeters wider at one end than the other. It was incredible, Nachtigall says. We ordered them to be the same, the machinist said they were the same, and the animal said, no, they're different. And she was right. These last couple, equally cool. Things that we cannot do. Sharks, and I'm leaving out the bits where some animals, like more myrid and gymnoid fishes, can generate electricity, the electric eels. Many animals have the innate sense to detect electrical currents, at least in the aquatic realm. And not in the way that makes your hair stand up on your head sense when you feel a lightning strike or stick your finger in a socket, but the I can find prey even when it's buried in the sand where it can't be seen, smelled, heard, tasted, touched, or even distant touched with a lateral line kind of way. In 1678, Italian physician Stefano Lorenzini noticed that the face of the electric torpedo ray was freckled with small pores, thousands of them, each opening into a jelly-filled tube. Other rays had similar pores and tubes, as did their close relatives, the sharks. These structures eventually became known as the ampullae of Lorenzini, but neither he nor any of his contemporaries knew what their clues were for. In 1971, he noticed was shown that a small spotted cat shark could detect animals even when they were buried in the sand, and that those were, in fact, electroreceptors of basically sensing biomechanical movements that generate electrical currents inside an animal. And then our final one, equally interesting, in the sea turtles, having an internal compass, like we had on our boat, to navigate the Earth or starless nights in the absence of landmarks would be pretty cool. Our boat had that ability, but so do sea turtles. Few migrations are as treacherous or as lengthy as those undertaken by sea turtles. Hatching from an egg that was buried in a sandy beach, a baby turtle must run a gauntlet of crab claws and bird beaks in its ungainly crawl toward the ocean. Once in the water, it must flee from the coastal shallows, where it can be easily grabbed from above by seabirds or below from fish. By the time it gets out into the ocean and completes a full migration, and this is for turtles out of Florida, around the Atlantic Ocean and returns to North America, it finds its way back to its original nesting beach, the females do. But by 1990s, not so long ago, No one had worked out how inexperienced turtles could pull this off with such grand migrations, a state of ignorance that the late Archie Carl lamented as, quote, an insult to science. At first, Ken Lohman couldn't understand the fuss. Armed with a newly acquired PhD and the hubris of youth, he thought the answer was obvious. The turtles used to use magnetic compass. It would be a simple matter to build his own magnetic coils and put hatchlings through some version of the then classic Robin experiments. He had signed up for a 2-year project and, quote, my main concern was what I would do for the second year, he tells me. That was over 30 years ago. The only part I got was right was that they have a magnetic sense. The part he got wrong was that they have two. They are actually able to sense the movement of the earth. So that then brings us to the end of our journey through the animal world. But now what I want to be able to do at the end of our tour of our senses is to, what you're listening to now is the sound of an outboard engine running in a boat going through past Newport, Oregon. And one of the things that Ed likes to point out is that we built our world to match our Umwelt. Perhaps we need to be aware, because of all these amazing ways in which animals sense their world, perhaps we need to make sure that we build our world in ways that don't impact on the Umwelt of others. What happens when we start to mess with that environment? So it's easy to understand the impacts that microplastics or DDT or asphalt and oil have on the environment, because we can visualize those. But Young notes that sensory pollution is less well understood and likely harder to mitigate. Imagine you're a whale near Newport or a fish, and that noise gets louder and louder and louder. When the motor is quiet and far away, it's still easy to talk, still easy to hear. You can chat with your neighbors, find mates, locate prey. But as the boat draws closer or more vessels show up, the ambient noise environment starts to interfere with your ability to perceive the world and communicate. Wave after wave, noise develops what you're trying to say, what you're trying to listen for. Eventually, the noise in the environment surpasses your ability to hear or speak. You're left with a couple of choices. You can continue to talk at the voice level that you've been talking at. You can yell louder, or you can stop talking altogether. Any of these choices can have negative impacts on your ability to survive. That's noise pollution, and it affects animals that live in a different Umwelt than us. And while that's an example of noise pollution, keep in mind that light pollution, electromagnetic pollution, and there's others, are how Young wraps up his book. All right, so. So I'm going to finish up with a couple of different things. First, I never told you what we found in Port Orford. What did we learn about our marine life study in Port Orford? Well, it turns out that black rockfish, which normally move around a lot, move less and contract their range in the presence of a seismic survey air gun. China rockfish, which barely move at all, move even less. And lingcod, they totally left the system when that seismic survey vessel was sending out its air pulses over and over and over again, and they came back when it was done. So yes, the fish not only detected, but responded to this noise in their environment. This is made all the more incredible by the fact that the closest that RV Langseth ever got to the fish we were studying was 35 kilometers. Okay. So, looking at my clock, I sense my time is coming to an end. So here's my review. I loved this book. First book I've read cover to cover in a long time, actually, so thanks for affording me that luxury. I found the book strangely personal and compelling. First, Young describes how much of our perception of vision has changed over the years, as an example, and potentially how dumb and arrogant we are for how we think about it. In doing so, he actually does a really good job of describing the scientific process. We learn things, we think they're this way, but no, they're actually not this way, they're that way. Okay. Our thinking and reasoning changes and it becomes something else. Oh, but no, that's not the way either. And we advance through trial and error, and sometimes arrogance and hubris, and sometimes stupidity, and sometimes out of sheer good luck. But that's how we learn in a science way, and it was good. I've always wanted to know, fits me well, because I always want to know how things work, right? I want to know mechanisms. And I believe that's becoming more and more important in our modern world, because understanding mechanisms puts us in a place where we can understand and predict how animals umwelt and how animals will be able to adapt in a changing world. If we know the mechanisms by which they function, we can predict how they're changing, and we can think about that. Finally, Young does a great job of showcasing how scientists have worked to lift the veil on the world right in front of us and just beyond our fingertips. In doing so, I also note that he highlights the significant accomplishments of female scientists who are often underrepresented in such fields of study. And I want to take an extra minute to read a couple of those. First, both Bangs and Wenzel, who were auditory folks, who have since passed away, have been described as mavericks of their generation who pushed against incorrect dogma and allowed others to explore a sensory world that was deemed non-existent. And because of the examples they set and the mentorship they offered, many of the scientists who followed in their footsteps were also women. One, Gabriella Nevitt, was in the audience when Wenzel discussed her seabird studies, olfaction, in one of her final pre-retirement talks. Inspired, Nevitt began a career-long quest to find out how tube-nosed birds, the Procellariforms, make use of smell. Beginning in 1991, she would go on to any Antarctic voyage that she could while trying, quote, to figure out how to test birds from the deck of an icebreaker without getting killed, she tells me. She'd soak tampons in fish oil and fly them from kites. She'd release slicks of pungent oil from the sterns of ships, and every time tube noses arrived quickly. Nevitt suspected the birds were drawn to a specific chemical within the pungent glop, but she didn't know what it might be or how the birds found it since across featureless water. She only learned the answer later on Antarctic voyage and unexpected circumstances. So that's the first one. The second one, at night, spinner dolphins, a small but especially acrobatic species, capture prey by working together in teams of up to 28 individuals. Kelly Benoit Bird and Whitlau Au work together in work to show that these animals hunt with several distinct phases. First, spinner dolphins patrol. Then, once they found fish, they cluster together in tight rows and bulldoze that. Okay? So those two are particularly interesting in part because I've spent a fair bit of ship time in the Bering Sea with Kelly Benoit Bird. And that 1991 cruise that Gabby Nevitt was on in the Antarctic, my wife was on that cruise. And what Young leaves out of his story there, among other things, and everything he says is true, is that it turns out Chilean customs officers look very askance at several cases of feminine hygiene products being loaded onto a boat for a 6-week trip. All right. So just to wrap up, I had this book with me while I was traveling over the holidays, including spending some time with 20 friends on the Gulf Coast for New Year's. We discussed the book, and for the sake of full disclosure, even though I really love this, I should point out that a couple of my colleagues had also been working on reading it, and one of whom is actually a science writer and who has written books on unnatural selection and evolution in a toxic world, and whose husband is a fishery scientist. They did comment that they found the book a bit dense. I disagree. So what am I really taking from this effort, in addition to learning some cool new stuff? Well, I find myself walking my dog a little more slowly now, because she needs to sense the world on her own terms. I'll probably do a better job of turning my outdoor lights off at night, because what I see as illuminating and good can induce so much harm to those that rely on the darkness for their umwelt. And while I readily and already have a reasonably good appreciation of the diversity, complexity, and beautiful of the animal world, I'll never see it quite the same. Thanks to Carl Schreck for inviting me and Bonnie for setting this all up. I thank you all for listening. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Scott, so much. That was wonderful. It was really interesting. We have a few minutes for just a few questions. Did anybody have a question or want to chat? I'm going to bring the mic over to you so we get that in the recording, if that's okay.
Thank you. I read this book some time ago and found it just as fascinating as you have, I think. It's really cool. I have a question relating to senses of other critters like plants or microbes. Is anybody doing work on those types of senses?
Yes, and this is an uninformed response because I don't know the details, but absolutely animals and plants both have the capacity to respond to environmental stimuli. Some of it is probably effectively what we would consider to be reflex action, right? It takes more than just a stimulus and a sensory neuron to, it also takes some brain capacity to process that information into making some informed decision, if you will. But certainly we know that plants can rotate towards light and things like that. Microbes as well, but I don't know any of the details.
I really enjoyed your talk. Thank you very much. I want to agree with your friends who said it was dense, because I took it out of the library and it was so dense I had to bring it back before I was done, so I had to go buy my own copy. So I recommend that to anybody who thinks the density is a little bit much. Just go get your own.
I know there's been some research into the magnetic field, and that at the quantum level, some birds are able to detect changes in the spin cycle, and that's how they can migrate. Do you know anything about that?
I don't know a lot. I should probably turn this over to Carl because he's had some work with some folks that have done magnetic tracking and magnetic navigation in salmonids. But yes, and what's fascinating, of course, is that the electrical field is set up by a solid core and a molten magma perimeter for the Earth, and as it rotates, that creates magnetism in ways that I'm not going to be able to explain, but then sets up sort of this global geomagnetic field which has local anomalies that can be detected. The other interesting thing is that over the sort of broad history, those poles have switched. But keep in mind that those switches, it's not like today it's this way and tomorrow it's like that. That's thousands of years of switch. And so I think the animals have adapted and learned how to use those. How they specifically do it, I don't know. And how many senses do I think we have? Well, I would give us the original 5, but keep in mind, I'm also often of the opinion that we like to categorize things that actually exist on a continuum. It is considered that one. So proprioception, for those you know, is basically body positioning. And there are certainly people that lack that. And there's a story in the book about that, about somebody who lacks their proprioception. And without that, the individual could not walk because they couldn't tell the relative positioning of their different body parts in space. Yeah, and I think that's part of the sort of the balance and sense. Yeah.
Charles Athena's book, Becoming Wild, addresses a lot of these things. A wonderful book about animal sensory and communication, especially. And in regard to proprioception, I can tell you from my own personal experience having a neurological disease that if I am not really careful, I can't tell where my toes are and I fall down. So, and that's very common with this particular type of disease. And perception is just such a huge, wide range of perceptive things. For instance, how bees see colors, etc.
Thank you.
So thank you for sharing that. That sounds very similar to certainly what I've heard. Back to the magnetism question, one of the things that I didn't share is of all of this whole broad Umwelt concept, that's the one that Ken Lohman and others they don't even know how it works. They don't even know what the sensory structures are to sense magnetic fields. There's a bunch of hypotheses about things called magnetite, which can pull on cells, but it could be polarization of charged ions. They're not really entirely sure yet. I guess I'll also point out that in addition to Gabby Nevitt and Kelly Benoit Bird that we've worked with, my wife has actually also worked with Ken Lohman. So there you go.
Many, many years ago, Carl Sagan was making the point about sound pollution and said that the whales could hear each other from 6,000 or 8,000 kilometers. Was he being hyperbolic about that or no?
I don't believe he was, in part because we try to do the same things with our Navy subs. And again, this is oceanography and physics that I'm not particularly familiar with, but there are effectively channels, and there's something called the SOFAR channel in the ocean about which sound can, because water at different layers is in different densities, and even sound moving from one density to another affects it. So it was much reflect, and so we can get into some of these density layers and transmit over very broad regions. I don't know about the specific distance, but yes, long way. Great. Thank you all very much. I hope you have a great rest of your day.